I was 17 years old in 1969 when my brother asked me if I'd like to join him on a 3-day hike up in the backcountry of Yosemite National Park. He had just come home from Vietnam. Even though I had camped out many times with my family, I had never been on a hike for that long before, so I said yes. The first day, we followed a steep path that dropped 1,000 feet to the river. It was about the end of April, which is early spring in the high country, and Yosemite is a big place. We didn't see anyone else throughout the entire trip as we traveled over hill and dale in the beautiful Sierra Nevada mountains. The first night we camped near a babbling stream. After lunch the next day, we walked through a sunny alpine meadow covered in light green knee-high spring grasses and flowers. The meadow was situated in a valley surrounded by tall wooded hills, and it was a spectacular sight. And then we entered an aspen forest dappled with sunlight. There we noticed the faint smell of a skunk. It was weak enough that we figured the skunk must have left some time ago, so we kept on walking. Further into the grove, we came across a newly built windowless ranger shed constructed of thick corrugated steel. All the necessary tools and equipment to repair trails in the backcountry were kept there, so the forest rangers wouldn't have to haul them back and forth. We knew this because the front and one side were torn off with the heavy metal corrugated panels scattered all over the nearby woods. We stood there gawking at it for several minutes, trying to figure out how this could have happened. My brother said it must have been a big bear, freshly awake from its winter hibernation, that did it. But on closer inspection, there were neither claw marks nor teeth marks on any of the 8-foot-long panels. Some of them were curled into themselves like a C, and others were thrown up to 30 feet away. It was as if someone tall had peeled the sheets off like peeling a banana and tossed them aside. Nothing inside the shed was disturbed. Whatever peeled away the panels had no interest in the contents. The bears in California are mostly small brown bears, like on our state flag. I doubt a bear like that could have reached high enough on the shed to grab the top of a panel and rip it away. It was unnerving to consider what might have been able to do that kind of damage. "Let's get out of here and put a few miles between us and this place before we stop for the night," my brother said. I was more than happy to comply. Neither of us had ever heard the word Sasquatch or Bigfoot at the time. My brother was carrying a small hunting knife, but that was it. We had no guns and no bear spray. A small steady breeze kicked up in the late afternoon that stayed with us all night. When we got there, we were too tired from our long hike to build a fire, so we had supper of salami and cheese on bread with a side of fruit. And then we hung our food pack up in the tree and went to bed, and the wind gently swayed our tent for the whole night. The sun had not quite set behind the tall trees when we fell asleep. Sometime later, something woke me up. I had been dreaming that I was having a conversation with someone who reminded me of little Abner. I know I'm dating myself now, so I should explain that little Abner was a comic strip character in the Sunday comics when I was growing up. He was a big, dark-haired man with muscles like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm not entirely sure the person in my dream was human, or that it was even a dream. In any case, we talked for a short time, and then something completely woke me up. Instantly, I realized something heavy just outside the tent was hitting the ground next to my head, and I could feel the vibration of the impacts. I laid there frozen in fear as whatever it was, took a long, inhaling sniff only 12 inches from my head. There was no doubt that it had taken in my scent right through the thin material of our pup tent. Too afraid to move, I listened intently to see if it would move to my brother's side of the tent and sniff there. Instead, it grabbed the tent pole by our heads and started shaking violently. Wake up, I screamed, and as soon as I began to speak, the shaking stopped, so my brother didn't see it. He accused me of having a nightmare induced by the sight of that shed and told me to go back to sleep. And then he rolled over with his back to both me and the tent pole. Again, something grabbed the pole and shook it violently for 3 seconds. "There's something outside shaking the tent," I said. "It's just the wind," he answered angrily. "Please go back to sleep." My brother is more than just a brother. He and I are great friends. Never before nor since had he ever spoken so gruffly to me. That was as much a shock as the tent shaking. I was between a rock and a hard place, and I was sweating bullets from the fear of what was outside and thoroughly crushed by my brother's reaction. Well, I laid there and fought back the panic and frustration and listened for anything that might be moving around outside the tent. The gentle breeze covered all the subtle noises, and finally, either from shock or exhaustion, I fell asleep. At daybreak, we got up. There were no signs of anything having been around the tent, so we took down the pack and had some water. We decided we'd walk a couple of miles and then stop and eat breakfast. My brother was like a mountain goat, and I had twisted my ankle on the first day, so I was constantly lagging 75 feet behind him. But as we walked along, I began to have a dialogue in my head as if someone were interviewing me in a sort of a get-acquainted, friendly talking manner. It was as if someone else was asking the questions, and I was answering them. We were still in that high valley, so there were no trees on either side of our trail. Clearly, there was no one around me, but the conversation continued in my head for a mile or so. I felt a presence, so I kept glancing around to see if anyone was there, but no one was there. And still the questions kept popping into my head, and I kept answering them. And then suddenly it stopped. It was as if the interview was over. And when it was over, I felt a little silly for having thought about myself and my life as if someone were there listening to me. It was a bright, sunlit day, but I was alone. Why would I go on and on about my life and my family like that? I've only recently learned about mind speak and knew nothing of it at the time, and it was a very strange feeling. Well, at that point, I decided to enjoy the walk, and eventually we were back at the big trees again. And there we came across a log jam around a deep pool blocking our way. The trees were about 3 feet in diameter. My brother went around to the right where it was real swampy, and I chose to go to the left and jump from log to log while keeping my feet as dry as possible. But one log turned out to be a bad choice. The far end was anchored on the bank, but the end closest to me was under the log that I had been standing on, and I soon learned it was just floating in the water. And as soon as I jumped down on it, it began to sink. The crystal clear pool was about 8 to 10 feet deep, and as I jumped, I heard "run" in my mind. With a burst of speed, I made it to the other end of the 25-foot log before it sank too deep and dumped me in the icy snowmelt. It was the easiest run I had ever experienced. It felt like I was feather light, even with a pack. It was almost like someone was pushing me while lifting up the pack to take the weight off me. The log was sinking fast, but I seemed to be flying over it. I managed to get across with only one wet foot. Even as I was running, though, I couldn't help but think, what is happening to me? At the other end, my brother was blanched white as he fumbled to get his pack off. He thought he was going to have to dive in and help me out. At 17, it hadn't occurred to me just how dangerous the route I had taken was, and that maneuver in particular was very dangerous. If I had fallen in with the backpack, the water absorbed by the sleeping bag alone could have been enough to drag me under. This probably all sounds ridiculous to anyone listening, but it is how I remember it. Something weird happened on that log. There's no way anyone could have been behind me. No one was there but my brother, and he was in front of me. Even if someone had been there, their weight would have caused the log to sink even more. The explanation I have come up with is absurd to say the least. Many thoughts have run through my mind. Was an invisible hovering Sasquatch pushing me along and holding up my backpack? Or was something helping a human to save a life? It's definitely one for the book of the weird. Now I know I'm probably making a mountain out of a molehill. I wouldn't blame you if you laughed at my story. I'm laughing right along with you. The only reason I think Sasquatch is because of the destroyed ranger shed and the smell of the skunk just before we found it. And I suppose it could have been any benevolent spirit who saved me, but something did. As unbelievable as it sounds, it is exactly what happened. Nothing else of any significance happened on that trip. We never spoke of it again, and I forgot all about it. In recent years, I've listened to a lot of Bigfoot stories on YouTube. It wasn't until recently, though, when another person mentioned being sniffed through their tent that all that came back to me. Having something large sniff you through a tent is incredibly unsettling. Perhaps that's what caused me to repress the memory until now. I never saw a Sasquatch, nor do I know what the interviewing thing was. I'm just glad that whatever or whoever it was there to save my life when I needed it on that log. God bless them for that. I have always believed in all things supernatural and unexplainable in our strange world. Things like ghosts and aliens and wendigos, etc. I've seen things I couldn't even begin to explain, going back to as early as sharing my bunk bed in a room with my sister, and both of us experiencing and seeing and hearing unnatural things. This past May, I got married to my husband, Chad, and he's the one to blame for my unplanned binge dive into Bigfoot. It's not his fault, of course. I grew up hearing stories about Bigfoot from my very large family for years. I was always intrigued by what they were and if they were really out there in our Minnesotan woods, but it never really pulled my leg until now. What started all of this was because of a real Bigfoot encounter Chad told me that he had, and which he didn't tell me for a long time, and he predicted I wouldn't have believed him anyway. 10 years ago, it was late August, and Chad was a senior in high school. He had just turned 18, and he was enjoying his last summer weekend before school started up the following Monday. Him and his buddy were hanging out Friday night at his friend's parents' house. They started out the night playing video games and drinking soda and realizing that neither of them had eaten. They went upstairs and hopped in a friend's car and ran to the store. They decided to grab some steaks. Once they were back, they decided to grill them up outside on the deck in the backyard. The deck was 2 stories high, and the forestation behind the house was super thick and it was dense with trees. And there was roughly 10 yards from the house in each direction to the forest. It was totally surrounded. As soon as they lit up the grill for the steaks, they started hearing rustling noises coming out of the undergrowth in the tree line. Well, initially, they chalked it up to a deer or coyote or some other animal, and they continued grilling. They were used to the wild animals out in the woods. And then both Chad and his friend heard a loud double knock, like the sound of a cracking of a baseball bat against a tree. They both froze for a second, looking off straight into the woods where they heard the sound coming from, thinking, what the hell was that? Chad hollered out at it after a second, saying, well, knock, knock to you too, bud. Well, they both started laughing it off like it was nothing, and they forgot about it quickly, and then suddenly they heard the same double knock again. This time the sound was coming slightly from the right of the woods, and again the rustling under the bushes in the tree line started all over again. They finished their steaks. They were too on edge to enjoy them now, and they chucked their remaining T-bones to the left of the tree line, both of them flying past the clearing. And the rustling that they were hearing in front of them was now crashing loudly to the left toward those bones. They turned the propane off to the grill really fast and got the hell out of there. and they beelined it toward the house. His friend grabbed his car keys and says, "Man, let's get out of here." And they jumped into the car, and the tires peeled, not even looking back toward the house. Once they slowed up about a mile away from his friend's place, each of them pulled out a cigarette and popped in a Rush CD. I don't know why I think that's funny, but that's just kind of funny. They started off by listening to Tom Sawyer, because they both thought there was something relaxing about the music effects in that track. His friend was still driving, and they took a right down a dirt road toward the backwoods neighborhood. They reached a T in the road, and they took another right. The friend was only going about 20 miles an hour because he knew that deer were notorious on that road and people hit them all the time. Music was blasting, and they were singing back and forth to each other. And Chad looked out the windshield on a whim, and right in front of them, moving quickly to the left in 2 huge steps, he saw a damn Bigfoot cross the road. With eyes wide and in shock, his friend noticed Chad's face and asked him what was up, and he slowed down the car. Chad choked out the words, "It's a Bigfoot, man!" His friend replying loudly, "A Bigfoot?" Chad nodded rapidly, and his friend immediately whipped the car around, shouting, "Where?" They drove back about 100 feet, and Chad pointed to where he saw him cross the road. His friend pulled the headlights into the ditch toward the patch of broken, matted weeds, and his headlights were pointing at a tree about 75 feet in front of them. This tree stood 25 or 30 feet tall, and there was a 2-way branch starting up at about 8 feet from the base. Chad was staring at the space in the split tree and realized he was looking at a gray-brown, reddish hair-covered chest. He slowly looked upward and he saw the face 4 feet above the split, and it was staring right back at him. Chad said that this thing looked very old and very sinister, and it was definitely not happy that some kids had spotted him mistakenly. Chad was terrified, and he realized he was holding his breath. And once the friend opened the car door, he tried to scream, "Get back in the car," but he only ended up choking his words out. He was too scared to talk. Before speaking English again, he looked back at the tree to see if the Bigfoot was still there, and he caught this beast breaking off a branch toward the top of the tree like it was a pretzel. The Bigfoot then hurled the branch clear over the car, and immediately caught his friend's attention as it passed the other side of the ditch and landed with a loud crash in the field behind the car. Well, they looked at each other and they were freaking out, and Chad finally screamed, "Let's go!" The second he shouted that, the Bigfoot let out a deep, resonating, evil roar. Chad's friend froze in fear. The flight response catching up to him, he jumped into the car. Chad was already in there, and he slammed the car into reverse, pointing them to the right, and then slammed it into drive, and he took off fast, kicking up so much dirt and dust that they couldn't see the taillights. Neither of them said a word to each other the entire way back to his friend's house. They were trying to come to terms with what had just happened to them. Once they were back at the house, Chad asked his friend, along with using some choice words, "Can you believe that just happened?" "No, it didn't happen, because I refuse to believe it, and I don't want to be looked at as crazy," replied his friend. "Well, how can you say that?" said Chad. "You saw what happened. We don't have to tell anyone, but you can't ignore this." "Well, maybe you can't," his friend said, "but I can, and if you tell anyone I was involved, I will deny it until I'm dead." His friend finished the conversation and headed toward his dad's liquor cabinet. They weren't old enough to drink legally, but they both took a shot or two, not mentioning the encounter the rest of the night. "I thought my husband was crazy when he told me this story. I didn't believe him at first, but I really thought about it, and I thought this is too detailed to be lied about. So one afternoon, a week after he told me this story, he brought me to where this had all gone down 10 years ago. It was a nice sunny day, and I figured we'd go on the adventure with our dog. I parked the car on the side of the dirt road. It was 75 feet from the tree where you could still see the break from the branch. And when I saw that, I got goosebumps all over my arms. We got out and started looking around, seeing if we could find any clues from his encounter or new footfalls in the area. I was trying to look for the huge branch this creature had broken off and thrown, but I couldn't find it. We did find what looked to be a trail of matted down grass leading to the tree from the dirt road. And on the opposite side of the road, the trail of matted down grass continued into the forest. On that side, we found a fresh break of a tree branch sticking straight up in the dirt, like someone had stuck it there very recently, sort of like a marker. Instantly, we both smelled something rancid. It was like death and sewage, and we covered our noses. We were standing completely still at this moment. We were 100 feet from that tree line. The sounds of the bugs and birds had completely stopped, and our dog was on guard. Her hair was standing straight up, and she was growling, and she was staring in the direction of those trees. We heard a couple of whistles coming from the left and the right, and then some more in front of us. Chad and I started walking backwards slowly, and our dog ran to the car and jumped in. And when we got there, she was shaking in fear. I still wasn't able to see anything, but the feeling of the fear creeped up on me, and we just kept walking slowly back to the car, not making any sudden moves. That was when I stopped dead in my tracks because I realized I was now looking at a large reddish-brown figure in the tree line, and then I saw it crouch down and disappear once he had noticed that I noticed him. I held in a scream, my heart was pumping, and Chad and I booked it back to the car. We didn't peel out, we just drove slowly down the road, and I was looking out the window toward the tree line to see if I could see anything again, and I spotted a different but similar creature with darker hair, and it was significantly smaller. I pulled my phone out and took a picture, but this thing noticed me too soon and hid as soon as I snapped the photo. And then we drove away, and we haven't gone back there since. I believe my husband now 110%, and I have proof of my own that Bigfoot is out there. You can call us crazy, but I couldn't make this shit up. When I was 9, our family lived in Plummer, Idaho, a small logging town in the Panhandle. We actually lived on 10 acres of land in the hills several miles outside of town. My 2 older brothers were avid hunters who would go on extended hunting trips, and they'd leave from our house and head out to the middle of nowhere, pick a spot where they wanted to hunt, and then build a shelter out of fallen timber where they'd stay for the duration of their hunt. One year they asked me if I wanted to go. I would get to stay in one of their timber shelters. They would cook for me over the campfire, and they'd even let me shoot one of their rifles. They promised it would be a lot of fun, and I asked my dad if it'd be okay, and after they assured him that they would take good care of me, he agreed to let me go. We headed out on a Friday evening, and I remember the day because it meant I would be missing Saturday morning cartoons the next morning. Oh man, anything that interrupted Saturday morning cartoons was horrible for me too, brother. I agree with that, but I digress. For a kid, that was a big deal, but this sounded like more fun. Besides, I really wanted to fire my brother's .30-30 rifle, even if it would probably knock me on my butt. We crammed into the front seat of my brother's regular cab pickup and headed further into the mountains. It seemed like it took forever, so I think we must have been up there quite a way. Of course, I was still a kid, and so the distance may have been exaggerated in my mind, but it seemed like it took a really long time. We finally parked in a clearing outside of the main tree line, and we hiked the rest of the way in. We went far enough in that one of my brothers had to carry me on his back for the last half of the walk to the campsite. And by the time we got there, it was getting late. At least it was for me, so I sat on a log and watched as my brother set up the camp and started a fire. Then we went into the shelter, crawled into our sleeping bags, and we fell asleep. The next morning, we got up at the start of the day, but our food supply was gone. My brothers had hung it in a large pine tree the night before. I remember it looking impossibly high to my juvenile mind. There were broken branches all over the ground around that tree. These were big branches, not just little branches, and they were broken off way up the trunk. My older brother, who was 6 foot 5 inches tall, remarked that he would have had to use a 10-foot ladder to get up there. My oldest brother was sure it wasn't a bear because he'd chosen a branch that stuck out from the tree and black bears would be too small to reach it. He figured even a grizzly wouldn't have been able to get up to that bag. They both looked pretty confused and angry. Now we would have to leave the next day, which meant that they would only have one day to hunt. It was just sad, really, and I was looking forward to having bacon and eggs cooked on the campfire. They'd brought just enough jerky and snacks to get us through the next morning, so my oldest brother went hunting while my other brother decided to stay in camp and teach me how to fire the rifle. He really only stayed because my legs were so sore from the long hike in, even though he'd carried me halfway. That evening, my oldest brother returned to camp empty-handed. He told us that it had been a very strange day. While he was out there, he didn't see any signs of anything. He didn't see any of the usual small forest animals. He didn't even see any birds. He couldn't find any deer tracks when there were usually tons of them. Plus, there was a strange, horrible smell. My older brother mentioned that he'd smelled something weird the night before, too. Well, disappointed that the trip had been a bust, we crawled into our sleeping bags that night with plans to pack up and leave the next morning. But it wasn't long before we heard branches breaking and knocking sounds just outside camp. Then something started grunting, and we all sat up to listen. At first, my brothers thought it was other hunters, but the grunting got louder, and it was accompanied by something really big stomping around. My oldest brother grabbed his rifle and stuck his head out to look around. He popped right back in and yelled, "Grab the guns! We're leaving now!" My other brother started to pack, but my oldest brother told him to leave everything else and to carry me on his back the whole way. At this point, I was really scared and I had started crying. The last thing I remember was a strange howling sound. It wasn't like a dog or a coyote or a wolf. This was deeper and louder. The hike back to the truck took what felt like hours. When we got there, my brother threw me into the cab and we were gone. I don't know what it was out there that night. I never saw it, but neither of my brothers ever hunted that area again. And over the years, I've tried to get my oldest brother to tell me what he saw. And after all this time, he still won't talk about it.